Hello, my name is Keller Geiswhite, and I have been assigned the task of creating an historic framework project. Professor Ritter, I appreciate the freedom of creativity you gave us for this assignment, and instead of writing an essay, I decided to take advantage of the opportunity and have some fun. If I can make something fun, it's one of the best memorization techniques there can be for me. So, I'm not the best artist, but I'm going to try to attempt to illustrate while I speak. I hope you enjoy this video and can get a laugh out of some of my drawings. My topic is the events that led up to the Constitutional Convention. I'll start by adding a timeline up here at the top that I'll come back to later. After the Declaration of Independence and the beginning of the Revolutionary War, the Founding Fathers started to draft the Articles of Confederation. Now that they were separated from Britain, they needed a way to organize themselves. The Articles were drafted by Congress in 1777 and ratified 4 years later. They were much different than the Constitution we have today. Under the Articles of Confederation, there wasn't really a strong government. It was more like a mutual defense union with free trade. Imagine a confederation of states, almost as if they were different countries, that all made agreements to keep peace and free trade. Almost all the governing power was in the state and not the federal level. I believe this is partially because of the experience of a monarchy they had just come out of. Fearing the new continent would result just like Great Britain, the Founding Fathers went the opposite direction and based the new system off the ideal of limited government. In 1781, the Articles are ratified, and so marks the first point on our timeline. As soon as the Articles became ratified, one flaw became increasingly apparent over the others, and this was money. The federal government did not have the power to bring in revenue. It could only request that the states contribute to their needs, almost like a charitable act. This was a problem because without funds necessary, there was no strong federal militia, and Congress always had the fear of being close to bankruptcy. This marks the second point on our timeline. So maybe they had economic problems. So what? Did they still do their job? Well, that was another flaw with the Articles of Confederation. In order to make an amendment to the Articles of Confederation, all 13 states who had one representative each had to unanimously agree. And in order to make any law, they needed at least 9 out of 13 members to agree. This proved to be very difficult, and we see an example of it in 1781 when Robert Morris, who was appointed Superintendent of Finance, proposed a plan because of the economic struggles under the Articles. He wanted to institute a tax to pay off war debt, but because he couldn't get 8 others to agree, the plan was never adopted. I'll mark this as the third event on the timeline. So I feel like I've begun to bash the Articles of Confederation, when there are actually some things they did good. One of the big things that the Articles did was it unified the states to a certain extent. This was important because in order to defeat Britain, the states needed to be unified and driven by a common motive. Because of this, they were able to create the Treaty of Paris with Britain and end the Revolutionary War in 1783. This marks the fourth event on our timeline. 2 years later, in 1785, we see another good thing that was passed under the Articles, the Ordinance of 1785. This was a proposal created by Jefferson that outlined how the western states would be divided in the future. Many of the congressmen knew that westward expansion was coming soon, and knew that the addition of more states would make it even more difficult to get people to agree in Congress on laws or amendments underneath of the Articles of Confederation. I'll mark the Ordinance of 1785 as the fifth point on our timeline. The congressmen continued to find problems with the Constitution and wrote so many letters that it would take far too long to study them all. Most of the letters were outlining some of the problems the young government was facing under the Articles of Confederation, and speculating what might happen soon if some of these issues were not fixed. In 1786, their fears came to fruition. In Massachusetts, a group of farmers led by Daniel Shays incited a rebellion. What had happened was they had fought in the Revolutionary War and had never been paid for their efforts. They were also experiencing very high state taxes. This led them to rebel against the government to be paid. The problem was that the government, because it was unable to take any type of tax, had no money. And better yet, they had no money, so they could not form any militia to suppress the rebellion. The rebellion lasted for 5 months until the governor of Massachusetts finally formed a militia and ended it in January of 1787. This is seen as the inciting incident of the Constitutional Convention because it brought out into the open and proved the fears that the congressmen were already having. Shays' Rebellion led Washington and other nationalists, including Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, to proclaim that the Articles of Confederation were inadequate. Shays' Rebellion is the 6th item on our timeline. Right after Shays' Rebellion broke out, Congress attempted to meet in Annapolis for a convention, but only 5 delegates showed up, so they decided to meet again in Philadelphia in May. I'll add this as the 7th event on our timeline. To add to all of this, right in the wake of the rebellion, Congress received word that the Impost Amendment, which was an amendment proposed in 1781 to give Congress the power to levy taxes, had failed the ratification process. At this point, it's obvious that something must change, and I also believe that this news also led more representatives to attend the convention in May. That marks my 8th point on the timeline. The day had finally come. 12 out of 13 states sent delegates to Philadelphia to join in a constitutional convention in hopes of fixing the flaws in the Articles of Confederation. Rhode Island did not attend because they were not a fan of centralized government. The delegates all agreed that there needed to be a stronger centralized government, but most thought that they would just amend the Articles of Confederation. In short, after lots of debate, they scrapped the old document and drafted the Constitution of the United States, outlining a 3-branch government with more centralized authority. That's the 9th point on the timeline. But this wasn't the end. Just because the Constitution was written doesn't mean that it was accepted. It still needed to be ratified by at least 9 states. Funny enough, we see another successful law slip in under the Articles of Confederation the July after the convention, before the Constitution was ratified. The Northwest Ordinance added to the Ordinance of 1785 and chartered the Northwest Territory and established a system for admitting states into the Union. Again, this raised the need for a strong government, as westward expansion would only bring more and more land and people that would need to stay tightly unified together. That's the 10th point on the timeline, and then of course we can't forget to add that in 1788 the Constitution was ratified. Thank you so much for watching. You can see the timeline up top, and I have my bibliography right here. You can pause the video to see this, and feel free to look up any links. Thank you so much.